Good evening from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, the editor of SpaceflightNow.com, and welcome to another episode of our live coverage of a SpaceX launch carrying another batch of Starlink internet satellites into orbit. Tonight's mission is set to deploy 55 of these Starlink internet satellites after liftoff of a Falcon 9 rocket from out at Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. That launch time is now less than 55 minutes away, weather permitting. Liftoff time is set for 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:10 a.m. UTC. This mission will be SpaceX's 10th launch of the year. And you're looking live now at the Falcon 9 rocket sitting out on Pad 40. This rocket stands 229 feet or 70 meters in height. On top of the Falcon 9 rocket, inside the payload shroud, is where those 55 Starlink satellites are currently buttoned up in launch configuration, flat packed, stacked one on top of the other inside the payload compartment of the Falcon 9. Below that is the white cylinder of the upper stage of the launch vehicle. The second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket is brand new, as it is for every Falcon 9 launch. It's the only major element of the launch vehicle that is not recoverable and reusable. And then below that, the white or the black band is the interstage adapter ring that connects the upper stage with the booster stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. Inside that compartment, inside that interstage adapter, is where the engine bell for the upper stage Merlin engine is sitting. And then below that is the first stage booster of the Falcon 9. This booster is going for its 12th flight tonight. This is booster number 1062 in SpaceX's inventory, with 11 flights already under its belt. You can see the markings, scorch and soot markings from those previous 11 flights on the outer skin of that launch vehicle. We'll see that booster turn a bright white once SpaceX begins loading propellants into that launch vehicle, beginning at T-minus 35 minutes. The weather forecast tonight has improved somewhat from the earlier forecast, which was quite bleak. Right now, the forecast team is predicting a 60% chance of favorable conditions, according to SpaceX, for liftoff of this Falcon 9 rocket at 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, that's 5:10 a.m. UTC. The earlier weather forecast that we've been monitoring over the last couple of days was, again, more dire, with just a 20% probability of favorable weather for liftoff, but that has improved to a 60% chance of go conditions for launch now. So launch time is now 52 minutes away. We'll have updates throughout the remainder of the countdown, as well as throughout the Falcon 9's initial ascent into orbit. Here's a look at the weather radar around the Florida spaceport. You can see some of the earlier shower and thunderstorm activity that impacted the area a few hours ago has moved offshore. There is another complex of thunderstorm and rain shower activity over the Orlando area, moving off to the northeast. If that remains on its present course, it may just pass north of the launch area. So weather conditions still iffy, but the forecast has improved from the earlier outlook. Again, now a 60% chance of favorable conditions for liftoff at 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time. If the weather doesn't look good, SpaceX has backup opportunities overnight tonight. One of those would be at 1:51 a.m. Eastern Time, and then there's a third and final opportunity tonight, or Sunday morning, really, at 3:32 a.m. Eastern Time. So 3 different instantaneous opportunities available for SpaceX to get this mission off the ground overnight. But right now, the team is targeting the first of those 3 opportunities at 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:10 UTC. The SpaceX launch team will be polled in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so for their readiness to proceed into propellant loading. They'll get a weather briefing from the launch weather officer from the U.S. Space Force ahead of that poll before they make the decision to proceed into propellant loading. They want to make sure the weather is favorable to give them a good chance of launching at 12:10 a.m. if they begin loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket. So now 50 minutes to go until launch time. Everything looking good for liftoff at 12:10 a.m. Eastern. Now inside of 44 minutes until tonight's launch time, which remains scheduled for 12:10 a.m. Eastern, 5:10 a.m. UTC. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us a lot to expand or have as big of an audience as possible for our coverage.
Countdown net. Propellant load and launch go-no-go poll is open for your buy at this time. Step 56.69. We are continuing to progress towards a launch at the first opportunity this evening. We'll have another check with the weather officer here in about 3.5 minutes to reconfirm, but this is our current intention. So please evaluate your launch commit criteria and indicate readiness on step 56.69.
That was a voice from SpaceX Launch Control confirming their intentions to target the first of the 3 launch opportunities tonight or Sunday morning at 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time. The exact launch time, for those of you who keep track of those things, is targeted for 12:10 and 10 seconds. So 12:10:10 Eastern Time, 5:10:10 UTC. As I was saying, if you haven't done so, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That would really help us out a lot. We really appreciate your support in that way. So the SpaceX launch team is now going through their readiness poll, registering their go and no-go or no-go for launch at 12:10 a.m. and also a go or no-go for the beginning of propellant loading, which is set to begin in about 7 minutes. At T-minus 35 minutes is when the 1,000,000 pounds of densified kerosene and liquid oxygen will begin flowing into the Falcon 9. So you can see the weather radar that we're streaming shows that complex of storms and rain showers over the Orlando area moving off to the northeast. And the official outlook now calls for a 60% chance of acceptable weather at this 12:10 a.m. launch opportunity.
Countdown net polling is complete. We're go for propellant load and launch.
We just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the readiness poll is complete and all stations are go for propellant loading and launch. So SpaceX is going for the first of these 3 opportunities tonight. Everything remains on track for liftoff, weather permitting, at 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:10 a.m. UTC. Again, if you haven't done so, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That would really help us a lot in gaining a larger audience for our coverage. This will be SpaceX's 10th launch of the year. And with that final go for propellant loading we just heard, loading of liquid oxygen and kerosene should get underway in about 2 minutes or so.
Thanks for waiting for propellant load.
As SpaceX prepares to start loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket, here's a look at what the Starlink internet satellites look like in their launch configuration. This is a file photo from a previous mission. We don't have a photo of this exact batch of satellites, but they look much like this, stacked one on top of the other, flat packed inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9. Metallic retention rods hold these satellites onto the upper stage during these final launch preparations and during the flight into orbit. And once they're in the proper orbit, about an hour after liftoff for tonight's mission, those retention rods will be released, allowing the 55 Starlink internet satellites to be deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket. And here's in this photo you can see.
A reminder and abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief CE or LD, and they'll approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold on this countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into launch abort auto. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
That was a voice from SpaceX Launch Control giving his team instructions in case there is an abort during this final countdown sequence. Again, this file photo from a previous mission shows what the Starlink internet satellites looked like just before encapsulation inside the Falcon 9's payload fairing. You can see one half of that fairing visible in this view, in this photo from a previous flight. These 55 satellites, each of these satellites weigh about 660 pounds or about 300 kilograms, a little more than a quarter ton in mass. They use solar power and will be using ion propulsion systems fueled by krypton gas for their final maneuvers to raise their orbit from the drop-off orbit
Launch auto has started.
of the Falcon 9 rocket up to the final operating altitude at 329 miles or 530 kilometers. That orbit raising will take a number of weeks or months depending on which exact orbital plane each satellite is going to. We did just hear the call at T-minus 35 minutes that propellant loading is now underway, a key milestone on the Falcon 9 countdown. And the rocket is now being loaded with 1 million pounds of rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen. That propellant loading will continue until about T-minus 2 minutes, at which time SpaceX will have a fully loaded Falcon 9 rocket weighing about 1.2 million pounds in final launch configuration. Right now, 3 of the 4 propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket are being loaded. The first stage is receiving both kerosene and liquid oxygen, while the upper stage is now being loaded with just kerosene fuel. Liquid oxygen loading on the upper stage won't begin until about T-minus 16 minutes. Just to finish up our overview of the Starlink network, here's what a ground terminal looks like for a Starlink user. If you sign up for the service, you'll receive this antenna that connects up with satellites as they fly overhead. SpaceX currently has more than 3,100 operational Starlink satellites in orbit, and another few hundred above that are currently making their way to operational positions within the network, which is spread out into multiple orbital planes at different altitudes, all in the roughly 300 to 350 mile altitude regime, or about 500 to 550 kilometers or so. This mission, with the 55 satellites on board, will bring the total number of Starlink satellites launched to 3,930. But a few hundred of those satellites in that number are no longer in orbit. They've either been decommissioned or have re-entered the atmosphere. This will be the 72nd SpaceX mission primarily dedicated to deploying satellites for the Starlink network. That number dates back to the first Starlink mission in May of 2019. This will be the 8th launch of the year from here on Florida's Space Coast. Here's a look at the graph or chart showing the different numbers of launches over the last 20 plus years since the year 2000. Last year there were 57 launches from here at Cape Canaveral and at Kennedy Space Center. Tonight is launch number 8. This will be the 10th launch overall for SpaceX to start 2023 at a pace of about 1 launch every 4 days. Those 10 launches include launches from here on the East Coast as well as missions from the West Coast out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. T-minus 29 minutes, 10 seconds and counting. Here's a look at the countdown timeline for tonight's mission. We've already passed a couple of these milestones. Propellant loading began at T-minus 35 minutes, right on time. At T-minus 20 minutes, we expect to see the so-called big vent from the strong back. That will be a visual that if you're watching you won't miss, because a big stream of oxygen gas, gaseous oxygen, will be coming from a vent on the strong back next to the Falcon 9 rocket. That's a final preparation to begin loading liquid oxygen into the upper stage, which will get underway at T-minus 16 minutes. At T-minus 7 minutes, chill down of the Falcon 9's main engines will begin. The Falcon 9 has 9 Merlin 1D engines clustered in an octaweb configuration at the bottom of the Falcon 9 booster. Those engines will be thermally conditioned for flight beginning at T-minus 7 minutes. At about 5.5 minutes before launch, we should hear a call from launch control that kerosene loading is complete on the first stage. Kerosene loading will be completed on the upper stage at about 20 minutes before liftoff. At that point, The kerosene tanks, the fuel tanks on both stages will be full. At 4.5 minutes, the strongback, that's the structure that is just to the right of the Falcon 9 in this view, will begin retracting to an angle of about 1.5 to 1.8 degrees from the vehicle. You'll see that visually in this view. At T-minus 2 minutes, the liquid oxygen loading should be complete on both stages. At that point, SpaceX will have a fully loaded vehicle, 1.2 million pounds in launch configuration. And then at T-minus 60 seconds, command will be given to switch control of the countdown from an automated sequencer on the ground side, which is currently controlling the countdown, to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer, which will oversee the final steps to prepare the rocket for flight over that last minute or so until liftoff. Also, in the final minute before launch, the propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure, and the launch director will give their final go for liftoff at T-minus 45 seconds. At T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller will give the command to light the 9 Merlin Wendy engines using an igniter fluid called TTEB, triethyl aluminum triethyl borane it's called. It has a distinctive green flash that you may see when those engines light up at T-minus 3 seconds. Once all 9 engines are firing at full power, and if they pass a health check, the Falcon 9 computer will give the command to open clamps at the bottom of the rocket that connect it to that strongback and that transporter erector structure. It's called a reaction frame. At that point, the Falcon 9 will be clear to begin its vertical climb off of the pad. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 will be heading southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This map shows the approximate ground track of the vehicle after it heads downrange over the Atlantic Ocean. The red line shows the track of the first stage booster, which will detach from the upper stage about 2.5 minutes into the flight, and it'll begin a long arc downrange, targeting a landing on the drone ship named a Shortfall of Gravitas. This football field-sized vessel is floating in the Atlantic northeast of the Bahamas, about 400 miles downrange from the Cape. That's where the first stage booster will target landing about 8.5 minutes after liftoff. While that booster is doing its recovery maneuvers, the upper stage will light off its single Merlin engine and actually make a slight right turn, as you can see in this green line. It's called a dogleg maneuver, to ensure it doesn't fly over any of the Bahama Islands, make sure it doesn't fly over any populated areas as it heads downrange. And this is a slight turn to line up with the target orbital plane for tonight's mission, which is at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. The upper stage will head north of the Turks and Caicos Islands. Finally, we'll be heading just north and east of Puerto Rico and then out over the Caribbean Sea to inject itself into its preliminary parking orbit. And then sometime later, about an hour after launch, there will be another burn of the upper stage engine, and then the satellites will be deployed at about T plus 1 minute or 1 hour, 3 minutes into the flight. We're seeing some of the vapors from the loading of cryogenic liquid oxygen now. We're seeing these vapors appear on the outside of the first stage booster. Here's a better view of that. And the frost line from that cryogenic propellant rising on that liquid oxygen tank on the first stage of the Falcon 9. At the very bottom of the Falcon 9 is the kerosene fuel tank for the first stage. The kerosene is stored closer to room temperature, so you don't see that frost and ice build up, but the liquid oxygen is very cold. It's chilled to several hundred degrees below zero, close to its freezing point, in fact. SpaceX uses a method called densification to chill these propellants close to their freezing point, and that allows the SpaceX to load more molecules of fuel and oxidizer into the Falcon 9. That has a couple of benefits. One of those is a performance boost. You get more lift capability and more thrust for the Falcon 9. Also, that ensures there's enough leftover propellant in those tanks on the first stage for the first stage to relight some of its engines to come back to Earth for landing on the drone ship.
Stage 2, everyone, load complete.
We're now seeing the big vent from the strongback out at pad 40. You can see it's a breezy night here on Florida Space Coast, but we're not expecting that to be an issue right now. It is breezy, but we believe the wind gusts are below limits right now. We're now seeing also a waning gibbous moon rising over the eastern horizon here on Florida Space Coast as well. Could be right over the launch pad at the time of liftoff if the clouds permit that visibility. Could be quite a spectacular sight as the Falcon 9 climbs near the moon or by the moon on the way into orbit. Less than 20 minutes to go until liftoff of the Falcon 9 with 55 more Starlink satellites. We're seeing that gaseous oxygen vent terminate now, and that is usually concurrent with the start of liquid oxygen loading on stage 2 of the Falcon 9 rocket.
Stage 2 lock load started.
And we just hear confirmation that the stage 2 liquid oxygen load has begun. This is the final propellant tank to be filled tonight. Kerosene fueling of the upper stage is already complete, and liquid oxygen and kerosene continue to flow into the first stage booster. You can see that frost line continuing to rise on the first stage. Looks like it's over half full now for liquid oxygen on stage 1. Now less than 15 minutes to go. This booster, as I mentioned earlier briefly, booster 1062 in SpaceX's fleet, it's flown 11 times before. It debuted more than 2 years ago, back on November the 5th of 2020, with a GPS navigation satellite. That launch should deliver that satellite into orbit for the United States Space Force. It launched again about 7 months later with another GPS satellite for the Space Force. It launched for a third time in September of 2021 with the all-private commercial Inspiration 4 crew mission with 4 people on board, commanded by billionaire Jared Isaacman. It launched a Starlink mission after that, and then it launched another crew of 4 on an all-private commercial mission to the International Space Station for Axiom Space last April. Since then, it's primarily launched Starlink missions. Also has launched Nowsat 301, an Egyptian communications satellite as well. Most recently, it flew on December the 28th of last year with a batch of Starlink satellites on a mission known as Starlink 5-1. So this booster is going for its 12th flight today. We'll target a landing on the drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, out in the Atlantic Ocean near the Bahamas. If you're just joining us, I'll make one more appeal. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That really helps us out in reaching a larger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this launch to as many people as possible. One way to do that through the YouTube algorithm is to hit the thumbs up or the like button. We really appreciate that support if you can do that. You can also support our coverage in a couple of other different ways. You can contribute on the Super Chat function here in the YouTube chat. If you like what we do, please consider a donation there. It helps us maintain and continue our coverage of launches here on Florida Space Coast and around the world. You can also join our YouTube channel. We have different levels of memberships available for you. Depending on which one you choose, you can gain access to members-only bonus video features. And again, if you do that, you'll also be supporting our coverage. So if you enjoy what we do, if you like us bringing you this live coverage of launches here on Florida Space Coast, if you like what we do on our website, spaceflightnow.com, you can support our coverage by donating and contributing through our memberships, by hitting the join button, or through the Super Chat here on YouTube. "10 minutes, 30 seconds until liftoff." After the Falcon 9 departs Pad 40 tonight at 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time, here's a look at some of the critical flight events as it heads off downrange to the southeast over the Atlantic Ocean. We'll pass just north of the Bahamas. The first stage burn will last about 2.5 minutes, at which time the first stage will shut down its 9 engines and will jettison from the upper stage. That upper stage will light its single Merlin engine. It's a vacuum-rated engine with an expansion nozzle. That upper stage will burn for about 6 minutes to place the 55 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. And while that upper stage burn is happening, the first stage booster will extend titanium hypersonic grid fins. Will relight 3 of its engines for an entry burn about 6 minutes after launch. That will slow down the booster as it dives deeper into the atmosphere. And then a final landing burn using just the center engine on the first stage will begin 8 minutes 12 seconds after liftoff, and about 20 seconds later, at 8 minutes 32 seconds, that should be when we hear, hopefully we'll see, the first stage settle onto the deck of the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas. Around the same time, that upper stage will be completing its orbit insertion burn. It'll coast halfway around the world, and then will relight its engine 54 minutes 12 seconds after liftoff for a very brief 2-second maneuver to raise the low point of its orbit up to nearly 200 miles or nearly 300 kilometers. And then that'll be the orbit in which these 55 Starlink satellites are deployed an hour and 3 minutes into the flight. So from liftoff until spacecraft separation, 63 minutes. We want to thank those of you who have contributed in the Super Chat. Most recently, Dave Breen, thank you for your contribution from Ireland. Also, want to thank Celtic Spike for their contribution. And also Pandora Pinebox and Sailing Star Catcher, thank you for the support. If you want to continue, if you want to support us, again, we invite you to please contribute in the Super Chat or join us on our memberships on our YouTube channel. T-minus 7 minutes and counting. At this time, the chill down or thermal conditioning of the first stage's 9 Merlin engines should be getting underway. This chill down procedure is a thermal conditioning that involves flowing a little bit of... We just heard the call from launch control confirming the chill down. It involves flowing just a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen through the engine plumbing and the propulsion system to condition that hardware for the more rapid flow of cryogenics when those engines light up. Protects those against those engines against the damage potential of thermal shock. Also at this time, final checks of the range safety destruct system should be underway. This is all an automated sequence that's controlled by the ground sequencer computer, which will hand over control of the countdown to the Falcon 9's onboard computer at T-minus 60 seconds.
Stage 1 pin load complete.
And the Stage 1 RP1 load has been completed. 46,000 gallons of kerosene fuel have been loaded into the Falcon 9 rocket at this point. So both the first stage and upper stage fuel tanks are full. Liquid oxygen, the oxidizer, will continue flowing into the vehicle until about T-minus 2 minutes. In about a minute or so from now, the strongback at the on the right side of the launch vehicle will begin retracting away from the Falcon 9. We'll see that visually, we hope. It'll move back in about 1.5 degrees from the vehicle, and that'll be where it'll stay until liftoff, and then it will recline or retract at a more rapid rate when the Falcon 9 begins its climb to space. Now approaching T-minus 5 minutes and counting, everything is on track for liftoff of SpaceX's 10th mission of the year, with 55 more Starlink internet satellites at 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm going to hand off to my colleague Stephen Young, who will provide updates and commentary for the remainder of the countdown.
Tanks are pressing for Starlink retract.
Countdown is approaching the T-minus 4-minute mark. At this point, the clamps on the strung back are opening. The vehicle has been pressurized to create a more rigid vehicle for the retraction of those clamps. And we're now seeing the strung back begin to move back into its position 1.5 degrees from the vehicle. At liftoff, hydraulics will pull the strung back away from the vehicle further, about another 23 degrees at the moment of liftoff, so that the strung back is away from the vehicle and isn't damaged during liftoff. Now 3 minutes away from the launch of a Falcon 9 with 55 Starlink satellites.
Stage 1, lock, load, complete.
Just heard confirmation from SpaceX that the stage 1 loading of liquid oxygen is complete. To get confirmation that stage 2 is full with liquid oxygen shortly.
Stage 2, lock, load, complete.
There's the confirmation that the stage 2 LOX tank is full. The propellant tanks will be brought to flight pressure in the next few seconds. Being venting from the strung back as liquid oxygen vapors escape into the atmosphere. It's part of the pressurization process. There was the call. Tanks are at flight pressure. Now approaching 1 minute to launch, the Falcon 9's onboard computers will take control of the countdown.
Falcon 9 is restarted.
Confirmation that the computers are now in control. We'll await the final go from the launch director.
Go for launch.
There it is, the final go for launch. See the moon in this shot from our wide view. 20 seconds to launch. At T-minus 3 seconds, the Falcon 9 engines will ignite. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 with 55 Starlink satellites aboard. Falcon 9 has cleared the tower and is roaring through the sky towards the moon. Fantastic shot of the Falcon 9 passing the moon. We'll soon be hearing the roar of the Merlin engines as the sound reaches our vantage point at the Kennedy Space Center. Looks like the Falcon 9 is parsed into cloud at the Kennedy Space Center. We've got not exactly a clear sky tonight, unfortunately. Switching to a view from SpaceX, this coming from a tracking camera in a different location. Now 1 minute into flight. Approaching the point of maximum dynamic pressure. Vehicle is now supersonic.
Max Q.
Getting a view of the Falcon 9 through the clouds. Past the point of maximum dynamic pressure, that's where the velocity and combination of the Earth's atmospheric pressure reached their peak loads on the vehicle, and now loads are reducing as the Falcon 9 climbs towards orbit, heading southeast from Cape Canaveral. Starting to see some color in the plume. Like we've lost it in that view again. Switching back to SpaceX, which tracking cameras still has it in sight. We're now a few seconds away from main engine cutoff. SpaceX feed comes with a delay. We'll be seeing that shortly. Now we have main engine cutoff and separation of the first and second stages.
Generation. MVAC ignition.
Ignition of the MVAC Merlin engine on the upper stage. Coming up on fairing separation.
Fairing
There's
separation.
the separation
confirmed.
of the fairing. Now seeing a split screen view. Showing the first stage on the left and the upper stage on the right. Here's the view from our camera at the Kennedy Space Center press site. The second stage heading towards orbit, a plume opening up there. The atmospheric pressure reduces, the plume expands. We're about 2 minutes away from the start of the first stage entry burn. Meanwhile, the second stage continues to fire. Here's a view from the onboard cameras. And returning to our view from Kennedy Space Center. There'll be 2 burns of the second stage engine. This burn has about another 3 3/4 minutes to go. We're now 1 minute away from the start of the entry burn on the first stage, ascending towards a drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean.
Both
That entry
vehicles are
burn
following
was
nominal trajectories.
a report from SpaceX that both vehicles are on track.
Acquisition of signal, Bermuda.
Now about 30 seconds away from that entry burn on the first stage. Sometimes this is visible from the Cape, we may get some views. About 10 seconds from ignition of the first stage.
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
Stage 1 FTS has saved.
You're seeing that entry burn slightly delayed here in the SpaceX feed.
Stage 2 FTS has saved.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
The shutdown of the first stage. Second stage continues on its trek into orbit.
Both vehicles are following nominal
Heading-
trajectories.
Heading southeast from Cape Canaveral. See the trajectories of the first and second stages. The first stage heading towards a landing on the drone ship. We're about 30 seconds away from the start of the landing burn on the first stage. The SpaceX feed does come with some delay. You may
Stage
hear
1
the audio.
transonic.
You may hear the audio first, confirmation of the ignition, and then the video will catch up.
Stage 2 terminal guidance.
There's the landing burn,
Stage
ignition.
1 landing burn.
Drone ship coming into view.
Stage
Landing leg
1
deploy.
landing leg deploy.
And it looks like a touchdown on the drone ship. Falcon 9 first stage has
Stage
landed
1
on the
landing
drone ship.
confirmed.
Impact.
And we appear to have had cutoff of the second stage as planned.
Nominal
Yeah.
orbit insertion.
There's the call indicating that the second stage has reached its planned orbit. Now going to coast for about 45 minutes before second stage is reignited. Here we see that engine still glowing red, but cooling down. First stage on the drone ship, another successful landing for this booster. Seeing the
Expected loss of signal,
water
Bermuda.
deluge system there cooling down the pad deck after the landing. SpaceX has ended its webcast, so that's the last of the video views we'll get from the first stage on the drone ship and from the onboard cameras on the second stage. We're now 4 minutes into this 45-minute coast period. The second stage is approaching the coast of South America.
This is Stephen Clark again, reporting live from Kennedy Space Center. We saw a successful liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket at 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:10 a.m. UTC. I want to thank Stephen Young for his commentary during the final minutes of the countdown and throughout the Falcon 9's climb into its preliminary parking orbit this morning. Now T plus 14 minutes. Before we sign off our coverage, we want to recap some of the mission stats. This was the 203rd launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since this Falcon 9 debuted back on June the 4th of 2010, nearly 13 years ago. That 203 mission tally includes one in-flight failure of a Falcon 9 rocket back in 2015, as well as the suborbital abort test of a Crew Dragon spacecraft back in 2020. If you include those, it's 203 total missions of the Falcon 9. This is the 213th launch of a Falcon rocket overall. This includes Falcon 1s, Falcon 9s, and Falcon Heavies since 2006. This was the 12th launch and landing of the booster 1062. We saw it land on the drone ship successfully. This was the 174th SpaceX launch of that 213 total from here in Florida. This was the 113th launch by SpaceX from Pad 40, their most used launch pad, and the 168th launch overall from Pad 40 here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. One bit of trivia, this was actually the shortest turnaround ever between two Falcon 9 rocket missions, or any mission, from Pad 40. Also set the record from any SpaceX launch pad for the shortest time between launches from the same launch pad at about 5 days and 3 hours and some minutes since the last launch from Pad 40 last Monday night. So this was a new record. It beat the previous record by about 6 hours as SpaceX ramps up their launch cadence, targeting up to 100 Falcon launches this year. This was the 144th flight of a reused Falcon 9 booster. We saw the booster land on the drone ship, as we mentioned, as we covered live. This was the 171st landing of a Falcon booster. It's the 72nd SpaceX launch, primarily dedicated to placing satellites into orbit for the Starlink broadband network. This was the 10th SpaceX launch of 2023 and the 8th orbital launch attempt overall from here on Florida's Space Coast so far this year. With the Falcon 9 upper stage currently coasting just off the coast of South America, there's one more burn to come in about 38 minutes from now. That'll be a very brief reignition lasting about 2 seconds of that powerful Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. That will target an orbit that will try to place these 55 satellites into an orbit between 185 miles and 210 miles in altitude. That's 298 by 339 kilometers. Right now, the perigee, or the low point of the orbit, is somewhat lower than that. So this upcoming burn, which will last just 2 seconds, will raise that perigee from its current altitude up to 185 miles at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. That will set the stage for the separation of the 55 Starlink Internet satellites at 63 minutes after launch. That is roughly 47 minutes from now. We're going to conclude our live commentary, though, because SpaceX has concluded their live video coverage, and we won't have any views to show you of the final burn of the upper stage engine or the separation of the 55 Starlink Internet satellites. We do expect to have coverage of that via SpaceX's mission audio stream. We plan on keeping that up on our Launchpad live stream. So we'll have updates throughout the mission on that stream, but we're going to end our dedicated stream in just a few moments. But before we do, we want to look ahead, as we always do, at some of the launches over the next couple of weeks. Here's a look at the launch calendar. The next orbital launch is scheduled for February the 14th. That's going to be Tuesday night, U.S. time. That'll be the launch of an H3 rocket from the Tanegashima Space Center in Japan. This will be the inaugural flight of Japan's next generation rocket, the H3, that's been in development for some years now. It will replace the H2A and the H2B rocket family that has been in service for 20 years. This is the maiden flight of the H3, scheduled for the night of February the 14th U.S. time, or February 15th in Japan. It'll be carrying a Japanese Space Agency Earth observation satellite called ALOS 3, the Advanced Land Observation Satellite number 3, into a sun-synchronous polar orbit. Following that, the next SpaceX launch will be just the next day, February the 15th, from out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, with another batch of Starlink Internet satellites. This mission will be known as Starlink 2-5, targeting a high-inclination orbit, with another batch of Starlink satellites, as I said. That launch is scheduled for roughly 8:32 a.m. Pacific time. That's 11:32 a.m. Eastern time, 16:32 UTC. The next launch from here in Florida will be 2 days later, on February the 17th, next Friday night, with a satellite for the company Inmarsat, a London-based mobile communications satellite operator. This satellite, built by Airbus, will be heading up to geostationary orbit. It will launch out of Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. That launch is scheduled for roughly 11 p.m. Eastern Time on the night of February the 17th, or about 4 a.m. UTC on the 18th. And then following that, the next launch going to the International Space Station will be on February the 19th U.S. time. That'll be a Russian Soyuz rocket launching out of the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, carrying the Soyuz MS-23 spacecraft. This is a replacement spacecraft for the disabled Soyuz capsule that's currently docked to the space station that suffered a coolant leak back in December. So the Russian Space Agency is launching another Soyuz without any astronauts on board or cosmonauts on board from the Baikonur Cosmodrome to dock with the space station, and that will be the ride home for 2 Russian cosmonauts and a NASA astronaut currently living on the space station later this year. Their original ride home, again, had a coolant leak and is no longer deemed safe to return those crew members to Earth. We'll leave you with one last look at Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral, where the Falcon 9 launched about 21 minutes ago with 55 Starlink Internet satellites. Our next planned live stream will be next week on the 17th of February with the next SpaceX mission from here in Florida with the Inmarsat 6F2 geostationary communications satellite. We'll have coverage of those other missions on our website, spaceflightnow.com. And again, as I mentioned a few moments ago, we'll have continuing coverage of the rest of this launch, including the second burn of the upper stage, as well as the deployment of the Starlink satellites. We'll have updates on our Launchpad live stream. So click over to that here on our YouTube channel, and I'll see you there. If you're going to sign off, though, if you're going to call it a night, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Have a great night.